Okay, hi everyone. So I am Samantha Cotrera. I work in the Office of the Vice Provost Academic. I'm the Program Development and Curriculum Innovation Specialist here at York. That means that I work with all the different faculties, all the campuses on different ways to refine and define and develop their program, the curriculum of their program. And so this particular workshop is initially the main kind of thing I was going to help with the cyclical program review. And then we realized that the more that we can provide support for all the different areas of the cyclical program review self-study, the better that you can have these really integrated conversations about curriculum, about supports, about student experience. So this year, because we have so many of your programs going through a self-study, we wanted to create a series of workshops to be able to help you work through these, to answer common questions. And we can always answer questions on email as well. But these 5 workshops that we have developed are intended to help you work through certain areas of the self-study. Now, we had one a month ago, 6 weeks ago, just kind of introducing the self-study. That video is available online. You can watch it. There I had identified, I created a resource that kind of broke down the questions of the self-study into like when you can answer them. And essentially it was like all of the stuff that you currently would have access to, you can answer first. And then the stuff that you're going to need to kind of invest in a longer conversation, which, spoiler alert, is curriculum, can go next. And then when you get the data from OIPA, so institutional data, from the Office of the Office of Institutional Planning and Analysis, in February, we create a workshop there to help you with data analysis. And then we have a workshop in the spring to show you how to bring all of those different parts of the document together. We also had a workshop planned for the spring about retreats, but we moved that up to November. So next month, November 27th, we're going to do a 1-hour workshop on retreats. Don't worry, you'll get an email about that and more information. This is one of 2 cats that will probably be bugging us today. Now, I should say that from the last workshop to this workshop, I've gotten a lot of emails from you. So thank you very much for those emails. Often those emails are quick. They're like small questions. Sometimes I follow it up with an in-person meeting. Sometimes it's a clarification. Sometimes it's a bigger question. All of those emails are great. So feel free to email me when you have those questions, but you can also email the other members of the Office of the Vice Provost team, people who are actually much more involved with quality assurance and the cyclical program review than I, which is Jennifer Bethune and Nina Untade. And they're both here today. So if you wanted to say hello and introduce yourself, that would be great. I have it on speaker view, so you have to say hello for us to be able to see your face on the recording. Jennifer?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Bethune. I'm the Director of Academic Programs and Policy, filling in for Emily Rush while she is on a parental leave. I come to this role from the Quality Council, so I have some background in quality assurance and happy to take any questions. And I've already emailed with some of you. I recognize some names here, so starting to recognize some names. So it's good to see you all on the screen today. Thanks.
Yeah, we're so lucky to have Jennifer with this cycle of cyclical program reviews because her background in Quality Council is so extensive. So it's really wonderful to have her here while Emily Rush is on parental leave. And Nina, someone you all have gotten emails from.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nina Unantana. I'm the Quality Assurance Coordinator in the Vice Provost Academic Office. If you have any questions, you can email me at ucap@yorku.ca or directly email me. And if I'm able to answer your question, if not, I will pass it on to someone who will be able to. And I'm glad that you're all here today. Bye for now.
Thank you, Nina. All right, let's get started. Now, like I said, this area of today's workshop is the one that I am the most connected with. So when I don't do self-study stuff, everything that we're talking about today is the rest of my job for new programs or major modifications, et cetera, et cetera. Jennifer, because you're the co-host, you can handle the waiting room now, yes? Okay, great. I'll just ignore that. I'm not ignoring you all, but I will ignore the pop-ups. And so I was thinking a lot about today's workshop and what the best way to have these conversations with you, because it's one thing just to be like, this is how you do it. It's another thing to have you understand why we do it and buy into the process and kind of see why having these conversations are important and why setting time aside to have the conversations are important. And so that's really what I came to this workshop about. How can I ensure that you are aware of all the kind of larger issues that bring together the conversations about curriculum? And some of you will know some of this. Some of you will know like parts of it and it maybe has never come together. And some of you really haven't thought about it in these ways, and that's all completely fine. So for this workshop, rather than just like describe how to write program learning outcomes, because like I said, I actually created 6 videos for you this week about writing program learning outcomes, mapping learning outcomes. I wanted to provide you with an overview of what is expected of you for this, so you can start making a plan for how you're going to do this work and start thinking about your time and resources related to that. Now, I'm going to share my screen, but I'm going to do something that I have only done once before, which is share my screen as a background, so you can also see all the ways that I move my hands, because why not? And so this workshop is on curriculum and learning outcomes. And my goals, oh, thank you, Miguel. I'm glad you find it cool. The former Vice Provost Academic, Lyndon, had said that these were going to be cool. I think that's a pretty high bar, but okay, great. We're 10 minutes in, already hit the cool bar. Hopefully it stays that way. I have a feeling you all are going to be very, not annoyed at me, but this might be fitting that it's around Halloween. Okay, so my goals for today's workshop are to introduce you to the concepts referenced in the self-study about curriculum and assessments, in particular about program objectives and learning outcomes. The second thing my goal is to prepare you for the work involved with program objective and learning outcome definition, mapping, and assessment, and to show you what resources are available. So those are my goals. My bigger goal is for you to care about this and buy in and actually be like, yes, doing this, leaning into this process will be really great for my program. So that's also my goal, but not one that I'd want to put on the screen and have to make a particular commitment to. The other thing that I have is my commitments to you for this workshop is that by the end of the workshop, you will have information to be able to know what's expected from you when you're answering questions 3.5 to 3.11 for the undergrad template and 3.9 to 3.15 for the graduate template. And that by the end of the workshop, you'll have the information to be able to define program objectives and program learning outcomes, to identify the differences between them, and to reflect on what these might be for your program. And that you will have the information to kind of determine how best to engage in this process of defining or redefining, mapping, and assessing your program's objectives and outcomes. And that you have the information to identify the steps and supports to help you in these areas. Now, what is curriculum? Now, you might know, and you've already now tuned out, but just give me a second to not tune out. I also see on this slide that all of my animations are not going to happen with this background, which is sad because I was very thoughtful about that, but that's okay. So my background, my educational background, my PhD is in curriculum and teaching and learning. And so I also have a background in history. So the history of things, the etymology of things is actually quite important to me. And so the etymology of curriculum is a course to run. And it was started to be used in kind of a Calvinist tradition of providing an ordering to education, right? Like that is definitely an impetus of why we start defining curriculum. In the 19th century, it started to be used more commonly. But all educational experiences have a curriculum, whether or not it's defined or not, because the curriculum is the plan, whether it's explicit or implicit, of what someone should know or do or value or all of the above at the end of an educational experience. And if you think about, like, let's say you're teaching your grandchild how to bake, you don't have a curriculum, but you have a recipe, and you might, your plan is by teaching them how to put food together, or how to like carry traditions on, things like that. All of those different elements are part of your plan of teaching. And so everything has a curriculum, and there are 8 different types of curriculum. So while the written curriculum is something that we're familiar with, the expectations, the program learning outcomes that are written down, and some of you might also be familiar with hidden curriculum. There's also the curriculum that you actually teach, and the curriculum that you assess, and the curriculum that has supports like textbooks. There is the curriculum that gets recommended by experts in the field. There is the curriculum of just what not is included. Every time you make a choice to include something, you're making a choice not to include something. That is also a curriculum. And then there's also the learned curriculum. So all of those first 7 elements all have kind of hidden curriculum in them. They all have assumptions and values and histories and standards and expectations baked into them. The learned curriculum is also hidden. It's often hidden to us as educators because we can never actually know what people learn. Learning is a very personal process, and students can articulate some elements of learning through assessments, but what the things that they hold dear, the things that change their cognitive structure, we don't always know. And so by being really explicit about curriculum, we can make all of these work together. And that's why I think it's important to make explicit curriculum, but it's also a way to really ensure that we are providing a lot of opportunities to have conversations about the relationship of teaching and learning. So if a curriculum is a plan of what students are supposed to learn, higher education curriculum is the plan of what students are to learn in their degree program. Now, obviously, every time you teach a course, you have a curriculum there as well, but I'm talking kind of big picture, program, big picture. Historically, though, the plan for higher education has been implicit, because the program requirements might be written down, but like the content is like, oh, don't worry, this is what we do in the field. Like, don't worry, this is just what happens. And so our history of curriculum in higher education is these kind of implicit reverence to the discipline and the field. There's been a movement for like 100 years to move away from that, to make some of these things more explicit. And we do that to make degrees more responsive to needs beyond academia. It's not just about towing the line so you also get a PhD. And just to be clear, this is not some sort of new thing that was brought in. I've read a lot of journal articles from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s that also have these same concerns. Like, why aren't higher education degrees more responsive to the needs beyond academia? But making curriculum more explicit is also about accountability and to ensure the equality of the programs. And I talked a little bit about that the last workshop. And while I referenced the Universities of Canada criteria, Quality Council in Ontario defines criteria as well of quality, and that's part of having a quality assurance process. But just so I am clear about my own kind of theoretical and pedagogical commitments, making explicit curriculum, and I speak about this as an educator, not just somebody that works in these things and kind of theoretical models is that when we make curriculum more explicit, it becomes more student-centric because we are defining to our students and to ourselves, this is what we are going to do over this course, over this plan. And I also think that when we start being really explicit about curriculum and we start kind of articulating all of those hidden elements, the assumptions, the standards, the expectations, the history, we identify more opportunities to work through these hidden aspects of potentially oppressive traditions in our curriculum, right? When we are like, well, what does the field actually mean? Oh, it's a whole bunch of people that might not be reflective of the student body we have in front of us. What does this look like to start thinking more broadly about our commitments and our goals for this program? From my perspective, clear and explicit curriculum clarifies the teaching and learning relationship because as an educator, you are identifying really explicitly your goals, your commitments to the students, the requirements of what it takes to go through this program. It clarifies that relationship because there's a plan. Now, to be clear, that plan is not solid. When you are making, like, for example, I have taught a graduate course in which a learning outcome is define curriculum and identify the complexities within it. That is a seemingly very finite learning outcome, but the fact is it provides so much space for us to do so much more about what exploring the complexities of curriculum might look like. So my commitment, my plan is to ensure that we talk about curricular definitions and the complexities of curriculum, but how we do that is really responsive to the people in the room. So a plan does not mean a set finite definition of what's going to happen. As a post-structuralist that likes to make a nice chart, I think it really helps define the relationship about what at the minimum is going to happen in a classroom. And in the self-study, you are going to be asked about these explicit elements of the program. You are going to be asked about your goals and objectives, your commitments or your outcomes. You are going to be asked about your requirements, and you are going to be asked about how you are assessing whether or not this program curriculum is doing what you think it is doing what you have planned it to do. And if it's not, what is your plan to kind of course correct? And so in the self-study, this notion of thinking about explicit curriculum with these different elements defined, it's important to understand why this can be really useful. It's not just like, well, don't worry, we've always done it this way. In fact, that's often, like the kiss of death for any sort of innovation. It's really about thinking about explicitly, what are these things? What are our commitments? What are our overall goals that we all share? So when we talk about these explicit curriculum, it is, what is the overall plan for your program? How do the pieces work together? How are you keeping an eye on this? And how might you, this way, course correct if you are off track? And you already do have these pieces, but in my experience, most people are not very connected to these pieces in your curriculum. So if you are, that's great. If you aren't, which has been my experience, then this is the opportunity to really start thinking and articulating all those different aspects. All programs must have objectives and outcomes, and to assess them, to keep an eye on whether the program is meeting them. So again, I know you have this, but whether or not it's connected to everyone's teaching and learning processes, in my experience, is not often the case. And so my overall goal in having these conversations with you is for this to be a more prominent element of your program and more integrated in how people understand their teaching and learning of the courses and their experiences with students. So the self-study program is going to involve, or the self-study review will involve that you are having conversations amongst you in your program, amongst the faculty members, even amongst staff, even amongst students, to have conversations about and agreements about what the program's goals are, what the program's commitments or objectives are, how individual courses and other program activities work together to activate them. It will involve a conversation about how you're currently doing this. And it will involve a conversation about what the plan is to do this and to keep track of this in the future. And so, to be clear, if you're not quite doing this as strongly as you might be in number 3, which has been my experience, no judgment. The idea is that we are creating an opportunity for you to really define that right now and to set your program on a course to be able to do that moving forward. So where does outcomes and objectives show up in the self-study? So objectives show up in question 2.1, and then again in section 3, either 3.11 for graduate, undergraduate, or 3.14 for graduate. It then asks you to describe the methods for monitoring and assessing how the program is achieving its objectives. So that's where objectives show up. Outcomes show up in either 3.5 or 3.9, where you are listing your program learning outcomes. And then there are multiple questions underneath that about how you're meeting the degree level expectations, how it maps on to the curriculum, how student learning is assessed, etc. Now, this list is much longer, and you probably will have longer, bigger conversations about that. But just to be clear, like, we do provide you with templates, we do provide you with ways to do this. So even though the questions are longer, there are actually more supports to help fulfill those. Let's talk a little bit about objectives. I'm going to take a sip of water first. So Quality Council actually defines the difference between objectives and outcomes. We provide you a link in the self-study review template for you to read on your own, but essentially, program objectives are the goals of your program. They explain the potential applications, they situate the program in the broader scope, they're broader than program learning outcomes, they are your goals of the program. So for example, what are your program goals? Maybe your program goals are to develop critical thinkers, or maybe it's to connect research and industry together to develop professionals to respond to the needs of the 21st century. Maybe it's to develop lifelong learners who value art and culture. Maybe it is to ensure that students understand the ways that Indigenous ways of knowing can be integrated in STEM careers. Those are all program goals. They're all great goals, right? Let's take a look at one in particular, because we need to ensure that we're also having conversations about how we are meeting these goals. How are you keeping track of the way that these goals are being met? And we'll look at this last one as an example. Oops. Oh no. Well, I mean, you know where I'm going with this, and I just realized that's going to happen somewhere else. Well, anyway, so just so you know, you're going to need a plan and a schedule to look at whether or not this is working. But if you ensure you're meeting those goals, then maybe, for example, and this is what's hidden behind that blue box, that you have courses that have Indigenous content in them, right? You have courses that talk about career readiness. Maybe, so those are course-based things, but maybe you also have a yearly lecture series in which you bring Indigenous professionals in STEM fields in to talk to students, right? Like, that's also a way to achieve this goal. Maybe you are working more closely with Indigenous Council on a yearly or bi-yearly basis to look at the content of the curriculum in those courses and to maybe talk about the speakers that you're planning on bringing in. When you're thinking about meeting those goals, it is about courses, but it's also about all these other elements as well. And when you're sure you're meeting those goals, you need to have a plan to be able to think about how they work together. And you need to think about that as kind of a schedule. Okay, we'll do this at the end of every year, or like this will just be a clear part of the program, but this will check in every 3 years. This type of planning is what makes the goals explicit, what makes the goals kind of thoughtful and aware of the overall plan. And that's what we're asking you to do in the self-study. And what we're trying to get you to realize is a really good opportunity to align the ways that you were thinking about your program and your teaching to what actually is on paper and what is actually happening in the program. So when I say you need a plan and a schedule, this is what I mean with these two questions, right? When you're describing the program and its objectives, describing the program can be a short paragraph. And I'm going to be creating a series of videos on how to answer all the questions in each section. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in other videos. But the objectives can just be these bullet points. Later on, then we ask you how do you take a look at those? How do you monitor them? How do you assess them? And that type of, again, all the curricular and extracurricular elements is what we're looking for, as well as a bit of a schedule about what that might look like, a plan. So that's where objectives come in. Outcomes, as you can see, are a larger conversation because they touch upon so many different elements. And I guess when I say so many different elements, I mean people's individual teaching, which every time you talk about someone's individual teaching, that is also a whole garden of connections, right? Because teaching is such a personal thing. So we ask about program learning outcomes in the third section. And we ask about listing them, we ask about mapping them, all of these different elements. Program learning outcomes, I like to think of as commitments. They should always start with the phrase, by the end of the program, students will. And they're not a qualitative accounting, but it's an articulation of a relationship. So you are committing to students that by the end of the program, they will know certain information, they will be able to do certain things, and potentially they'll also value certain elements. So again, I like to think of them as commitments. If that's not a useful way to think about them, that's totally okay. You can just think about them as outcomes. You can think about them as expectations, but it is the idea that you are setting students up to be able to end a program by knowing certain things, doing certain things, and potentially valuing certain things as well. Quality Council, again, defines program outcomes, and they say that they should articulate what successful students should have achieved at the end of the program and what knowledge, skills, and abilities successful students will have acquired. Again, all very straightforward. And so then what are the outcomes of your program? What are you committing to students that they will know, do, and value by the time they graduate? So for example, maybe you say that by the end of the program, students will be able to define and articulate major theoretical concepts in the field. They'll be able to develop and implement a research project and be able to compare it to established research findings. And maybe they're more specific, like describe the urgency to respond to rapidly changing environmental conditions and propose responses that reflect both global and local concerns, right? These are program objectives. So it's not like you wouldn't be doing this all in one course. This is stuff that should be happening throughout a student's 4-year degree. Unless it's not a 4-year degree, but you can fill in the blank if it's a different length of time degree. And so again, the question is, how are you going to ensure that you're meeting these commitments? So if we look at this middle one here, maybe we say, well, in this course, students will define a research question and conduct a literature review. The next year, students will be in a course where they'll conduct and present on research. It won't be independent, like I'll give them a research question, but they'll start practicing that. In 4th year, though, they do need to define their own research question, and they also need to develop a protocol, because in the next course, they will actually conduct their research and then write a comparative report on it, right? So maybe you're saying, this is what our program is going to do. They don't do it in one course. They do it across 4 courses, and they do it incrementally across 4 courses. That's great. Oh, sad. But you can also say that, if you can see at the bottom, that you could host an upper year research fair every single year and take those results and keep them within your department to compare them over years. Because program assessment is not students' grades, like an individual student's grades. It's also not an evaluation of a professor. Like, that's not what you're doing. It's about the program. So if you are taking the cohort of students and then comparing it to a cohort the next year or the next year, are students meeting the same bars that you're setting? The other things that are in here are things like having yearly meetings in which professors talk about certain elements of these program learning outcomes and how they are recognizing students responding to them. It also, under this blue box, also says that maybe you are working with the library in order to develop a spiral curriculum in which they're introduced to concepts by the librarians in second year that get refined and developed over a couple years. And that's this coordinated collaborative thing. But again, all of those are great, but you need a plan and a schedule. And that's what a lot of the questions in this self-study are asking you to do. And so this notion of assessment plan for this particular learning outcome could involve course mapping, right? Here, I said that 4 courses do that. Look, not every course should meet every learning outcome for a program. Like, that's so silly. Like, they should complement each other. They should fit together like a puzzle. They shouldn't be doing the same things. But also maybe yearly check-in meetings with faculty and library colleagues, maybe a yearly research fair. Maybe every 3 years you're going to commit to sitting down and looking at whether the courses and the learning outcomes match up. Like, this is all part of an assessment plan. And that's what we're looking for you to start thinking about and developing. And again, it can be some really interesting ways for assessment. There's a lot of ways to do that, to reflect what is happening in your classrooms and the ways that they speak to the goals and the commitments or objectives of the program. Now, this is a course map, right? There's just one learning outcome, though, and 6 courses. You could also create a more broader course map. This is the same information, but I'm also showing here if it gets taught and or if it gets assessed, which is different. So maybe it is introduced, at a very introductory level in both course 2001 and course 2002. It's only assessed in course 2002 through a literature review. Don't panic about this. Do not panic if you're like, whoa, that just got very complicated. I just want to flag that this will come up again. And here's an example of where it might fit, where it might live. Now, if you remember back an hour ago, no, not an hour ago, 30 minutes ago, 40 minutes ago, I hope it doesn't feel like an hour. I said that these were my goals for the workshop, right? These are my objectives for the workshop, right? They aren't necessarily, they're what I'm going to do. They are my goals. They are reflecting what I'm going to do. When I said that I had commitments, this is what I'm committing to you that you'll be able to leave with. And you'll notice I didn't say by the end of the workshop, you'll be able to know this, you'll be able to define this, you'll be able to determine this, etc. Because I'm not assessing you. The way that you leave this, I have no idea if you are able to know and define and determine. So I said that you'll have the information to do those things at the very least. And this is why assessment is so important, because if I say, oh, you'll be able to define program objectives and program learning outcomes, but I never ask you to do that, I actually don't know if, as an educator, and again, I'm thinking about classroom practices, if I have taught material in a way that you have the ability to define these things. An example I use a lot is when I teach about intersectionality, for example. I can just say, like, today's lecture is on intersectionality, but if my learning outcome for that particular class is to find intersectionality, identify historical examples of that and use those examples to provide an example in the present, then I have to create my course, my lecture that day in a way that allows the students to define, identify, and look up and provide examples. So this is about really thinking about how is what I'm going to do at the front of the classroom interacting with what students are going to get from it. And when we're talking about program learning outcomes, it is that front of the classroom for like the whole collegium. So in sum, although I do have more slides, when I say in sum, I don't mean I'm finishing up, which I hope you're okay with, is that in the self-study, you are going to be asked to define these explicit elements of your curriculum and to articulate if you are assessing what you have planned for them to do. So for both objectives and outcomes, you need to define them and then provide an assessment plan. And so where to begin? So for the rest of today's workshop, I'm going to talk about the different steps that you can take. All of these steps have steps within them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about those individual steps. Instead, I'm going to highlight the resources that can support you with these steps. When I stop recording and we have more of a discussion and ask for questions, I'm happy to go over that if that is useful for you right now. But do not worry, I don't ever leave you with being like, and now figure it out on your own. This piece of artwork at York is also one of my favorite pieces of artwork at York. So, okay, step 0. This isn't even your first step. Just find your current objectives and outcomes and just see if they're usable. If you can't find them, don't stress about it. In fact, it's not, I actually don't think, if you are not connected with them to even know where they are housed, then working on steps 1 through 5 are more important than you finding where these are. Okay, so again, my goal is for this to become a conversation in your program that lasts much longer than the cyclical program review. So if you have them, if people know about them, if people use them, that is wonderful. Bring those up. That will help frame the rest of it. If nobody knows where they are, look, again, it is not worth all those emails back and forth when there are other steps that are going to take up more time. Also, find your current curriculum map. Again, you definitely have this. Does it represent what and how you teach? Now, here's the thing about why I know that you have these things, but you might not be connected with them. When we started, we in Ontario, we at York started talking about learning outcomes like, I don't know, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. We started with the degree level expectations that are provided by Quality Council. These are degree level expectations. You might be familiar with them as the DLEs, or for undergrad, they are the OODLEs. I've never heard anyone say Goodles for graduate, but if you do, there you go. These degree level expectations identify what all degrees across Ontario need to meet. And they're very important, but they're also not these revolutionary things. All your programs do them, right? And I'll get to why I'm saying that in a second. But when this conversation started, what people did and what the advice was, like from people that do this work. So again, this is a generational thing of having these conversations, is people took the elements of the degree level expectations that said like students will know theoretical concepts, and they just like put their program in it. Students will know theoretical concepts in whatever, like fill in the blank. And so so often people there's 6 degree level expectations for all the programs. And oftentimes people will have lists of like 10, 12 bullet points underneath all these degree level expectations that just reiterate the definitions of things that are provided by the Quality Council. And these are good, of course. It's great that your program is doing those things, but they often seem very generic and specific at the same time. So they miss like the uniquenesses of your program. They can miss like the streams or particular research foci. They might miss the commitments like that you have because we are here at York. Like they miss those things. And it's such a long list that of course no one's connected to them. Of course they're not clearly communicated to students. There's 50 of them. Like, oh my God. So when we're working with learning outcomes now, we want to have a much more concise list of like 8 to 12 learning outcomes. And they definitely have to meet the degree level expectations, 100%, but we don't start there. What we start with is your unique teaching and learning experiences at York. And when we start there, we will always meet the degree level expectations. When we see that we don't, we can go back and course correct, but like, here's the thing, we start with your program. So when I say like, find what you have, you might find a list of 50 and you're like, oh my God, oh my God. We don't want you to stay with that list of 50. We actually want you to develop a nice list of 8 to 12. And again, you're not alone in this. There's a lot of support, a website, videos, me, the teaching commons, faculty supports who I know are in this room as well. We are all experts in this area. You're experts in your program, so we can collaborate on working really well together. So when I ask you to find them, if you're not connected to the 50 that you have, that's okay, because the goal is to make a more explicit, concise, unique, personalized set that's much shorter to work with, much more integrative of the courses that you teach and the experiences students have. So step one, the actual first step of what you need to do is you need to develop a strategy for how you're going to engage in this work that we are being asked of you in the self-study. To be clear, if you are creating a new program proposal or a major modification or a non-major modification or a minor modification, sometimes you're also asked to do this work. So getting familiar with this work is really useful. So the first step is really to identify the strategy of how you're going to complete it. What do you need to do and how are you going to do it? Do you need to define your objectives? Do you need to define outcomes? Do you have assessment plans? What does your current curriculum map look like? What do you need to ensure a curriculum map aligns with redefined outcomes? And you also really need to think strategically about how you're going to go about this work. So are you, individual who is listening to this, are you going to write a set, provide them to your faculty colleagues, and then together you revise them? Or are you going to work together as faculty colleagues and do brainstorming and then try to create these statements together? Or are you going to work with support such as myself or the teaching commons or people in your faculty? What might that look like? Like, I can't tell you what the best strategy is for completion because every program is unique, right? Every program is unique. I know none of you have faculty politics that you need to deal with in your programs. I know you all get along great and agree on things all the time, but let's say you don't. I don't know the best way for you to work with disagreements that are long-standing, the disagreements that happen between like your thesis supervisors 20 years ago. So I can't provide a clear strategy for how you're going to go about this work, but you should develop a strategy. Now, when I worked with programs, and the teaching commons and your faculty support might work differently. I used to start by taking people's old 50 odd learning outcomes and turning them into 12, and then giving that 12 to programs to revise. Every single time I've done that, people are like, oh, thank you. That's really useful. Also, these are terrible and we're never going to use them. And that's because these older lists often didn't identify the uniquenesses of your program. So instead, what I do with programs when I work with them is I get them to identify things that they expect students to know, do, and value in their program. They will draft a first list of sentences that bring those together. And then I work with them really actively on revising them because because my expertise is in crafting those, right? So again, working together is really, really useful. Step 2 then is to do the work, to define objectives and outcomes. Now, if you already have objectives and outcomes that you know where they are and that all people agree with and that are connected with your teaching and learning that you do, that is wonderful. You can always take a look if they need to be refined. And if you're going to think about your time, learning outcomes are often require more from people because they are related to teaching and learning practices. So, that's a way to budget your time. So how do you do this? How do you write program objectives and outcomes? Luckily, I've created a whole website that helps with that. So there's a curriculum development and innovation website. You can get to it from the Office of the Vice Provost academic website. We'll put a link in the thing. You can also just search for curriculum development York and it will pop up. There's a page on curriculum development about program visioning. There's even a workshop breakdown, and that might be a good way to start thinking about your mission and your goals and things like that in the program. For learning outcomes, which are often a much bigger conversation, what do you know? There's a whole 3 pages here that talk about writing learning outcomes. And as of this week, there are 6 whole videos that describe them. What are learning outcomes? How to write learning outcomes, any sort of learning outcomes, how to write program learning outcomes. And so all of these videos are available. On average, they're about 15 minutes. The longest one's 20, the shortest one is 10. And I go through the website. So if the website is good enough for you, the website's good enough for you. And again, reach out for help, reach out for me, reach out to the Teaching Commons, reach out to your faculty support. Some faculties have people that help with curriculum, some people that have staff that work with teaching and learning. Everyone knows do this work, know what a learning outcome is. Feel free to reach out to them. Of course, I can't speak to everyone's availability, but I know that they are primed to do this work. And so they're here. I've also provided on the website a program learning outcome checklist if you wanted to work on them on your own. So you have a lot of options. You are not alone in this. After you write them, or I should say after you write the first draft, you need to then map the curriculum. And guess what? The website has a whole page on mapping curriculum. And there are 3 videos that are aligned to mapping curriculum as well. And I say course, well, what's the next? Oh, okay. So for example, a curriculum map is what I showed you before. You have your learning outcomes on one of the axes, and then you have the courses on the other, and you show which courses cover which learning outcomes. Again, I'm speaking frankly, I hate it when people send maps back in which they're all checked. Like, don't worry, we do it. No, that's not what this is about. It's not about like making sure you do it. It's not like making sure that course X, Y, and Z does all the things. It's making sure that course X, Y, and Z, course A, B, and C, and course I can't think of any letters right now, NOP, for example, all work together to achieve the program learning outcomes. It's not that we want all the programs to do all the things all the time, because then why do you have all those courses? You want them to work together, to complement each other, to work together as a puzzle. Now, I said too that maybe this curriculum mapping involves course assessments. And so here is another map I provide. And maybe you actually recognize some of these colors, like that structure from when I talked about them before. Because if one of the ways that you are, and most people do this, most people assess through this type of curriculum map, we actually ask for it. In the undergrad one, at least, we call it Appendix F, I'm pretty sure. We ask, like, what are the courses? Are you teaching this? Are you assessing it? Because maybe you're teaching it, but not assessing it, and that's okay. Are you doing it at an introductory level, more developed level, more mastery level? what assessment are you doing for this, right? So this is a way you can color code it, put things together. Questions I get all the time are we doing every assignment in every class? A lot of people do, because they assume that's the expectation of a chart like this. But really, when you develop a clear assessment plan, you can say like, oh, we really just need the like final assessments in these key courses. So again, that's a much longer conversation. Another question that I get is, oh my God, do I have to do this for every course? And the short answer is you need to ensure that every student across the program is going to meet those program learning outcomes in the same way, or in a equity-based way, an equal way, give or take. Which means if you have a program with a really strong core, required courses, maybe you're going to show that with the majority of just the required courses. If your programs are all electives, well, then you might have to map all the electives. In the videos that I have made about mapping the curriculum, I talk more about this. So please go take a look. And again, I don't want you to stress too much about how to do this right now. I want you to be more aware that this is the type of thing that needs to be done. How does it work for your program? And here's the thing about courses and PLOs and assessment. When I say course correct, I don't like, how are you achieving these learning outcomes and how do you course correct if not? When I say course correct, it's not about, oh, this course is bad because it's not meeting the learning outcome as we identified. Maybe it's this course actually identifies that what we've specified in the learning outcome is no longer relevant or no longer as important as some other content. And so when I say course correct, it's not about ensuring courses do different things. It's also about ensuring that program learning outcomes reflect what is happening in the classrooms, and that what you are assessing is also reflected in that. So when you do the curriculum mapping, you might actually find you need to revise the learning outcomes to better reflect what's being taught, and that's okay. So this notion of course correction is not about punitive finding out who's not doing the thing. It's about ensuring that what is happening in the classroom is reflected in how you're articulating the program, and how you articulating the program is reflected in the courses. So it is this kind of iterative revision process. It's not about like that course is doing it bad. It is maybe that course as recognizing that other things need to be reflected in the learning outcomes for the program, or the goals, the objectives. Step 4 is develop an assessment plan. Define an assessment and monitoring plan for both the outcomes and the objectives of the program. Now, the next workshop will be held November 27th, and it's going to focus on retreats. Again, I initially thought we would do a spring workshop on retreats, but programs have done a winter retreat and a spring retreat, and I actually think that's a really great idea. I got some feedback from this group that having an earlier workshop to talk about retreats so you could have one in the winter would be good. So we're going to have one in the winter. And in that retreat, in that workshop, I'm going to talk more about assessment plans. And between then and now, more resources will be available to you to identify what your assessment plan might look like and how you can develop an assessment plan that you feel works best with the teaching and learning experiences in your program. Because like what might work for engineering might not work for biology, and what works for biology might not work for philosophy, and what works for philosophy might not work for Hispanic studies, right? It's totally fine. Step 5, the final step, is to then reflect on this work in the self-study review. In particular, the section in the third part about program learning outcomes, bringing it all together. And I have found that when programs spend a really nice amount of time having these conversations, the conversations that happen about student experience and retention and enrollment and resources and collaborative opportunities with the academic integrity officer or the library or the teaching commons or the learning commons actually become much easier because you are really explicit in what your program does. And I know this is a lot of work. I know that this can seem daunting. And so again, my goal for the workshop was to allow you to see what is coming and to maybe like start thinking about what this might look like for your program in order for you to develop a strategy for how you're going to complete it for the self-study review. And again, from experience, I know that some people are starting from scratch, and in some ways, I am the type of person that if I knew I wrote a paragraph, I will spend longer trying to find that paragraph than to rewrite it. And in this case, like with step 0, I'm saying that if you already don't know where some of these things are and you already don't feel connected to them, it is a really good investment in your time to start thinking about defining the outcomes and objectives of your program now, rather than to find a document that you might not feel connected to. But again, you as an individual might not feel connected to. That might not be the case for the whole program. So ask around, ask around as well, and to see where people's understanding of their teaching and learning go in relationship to into the learning outcomes that are there. On the website as well, there is some information about mapping your course learning outcomes to program learning outcomes. And so I'm going to screen share that right now, and then I will see if you have any questions. So here is our website right now, Curriculum Development and Innovation. With our learning outcomes, there is the page on learning outcomes here. And all of the videos are available on YouTube. They're also embedded on these pages for you to find them very easily. For writing learning outcomes and mapping learning outcomes, hopefully you find this very easy to navigate. And as well, the videos right there to help you with these things. If you wanted to start thinking about the relationship between course learning outcomes and learning outcomes for your program, there is some information here. I haven't talked much about that, but that's often quite useful. And if you think a video on that would be good to share with your colleagues and to think about your program, I'm happy to make that as well. And that is our hour on curriculum and program learning outcomes, which I know can probably feel daunting, but I hope also that there are elements here that you feel that could be really exciting for your program. So I'm going to ask if there are any questions that I can answer while we are recording. And then if there are not, I will stop recording and then ask if there are any questions that you want to ask that won't be on YouTube. So any questions that will be on YouTube? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to end this video, but I will also be available for questions. Just a reminder, then you'll get an invitation. You'll get an invitation next week. Nina and I have to make sure we have the same email list and we make sure it's nice and clean. Thank you for your patience. If you still need to be added to the list, I think there were like 250 people on our general CPR list right now, and thanks again for your patience. The next workshop is November 27th. It will be an hour. We will have some guest speakers from Academic Integrity Officer, who's also in the Office of the Vice Provost Academic, as well as the Teaching Commons. We'll talk about which services that they can provide for retreats. I'll talk about retreat planning generally, as well as show you the resources that have been created for assessment plans as a topic that you could talk about in your winter retreat, for example. And you can always email me. My last name is Cutrara, Cutrara, at YorkU.ca. But Nina and Jennifer are also available for any of these questions. If you want to take this conversation and go directly to the Teaching Commons or directly to your faculty supports that can help you with that, no problem. The website is available to you. Go for it. But it's always nice to kind of just like check in and let us know how you're doing as well. So that's always helpful, so you don't get too far behind or too daunted with the work ahead of you. Okay, so I see there's still no questions. I'll stop recording and then take any questions if you have them.